woke up from the coma after 23 days and discovered through a conversation between nurses that my mother had sold my house using forged documents while I was fighting between life and death. I woke from the induced coma after 23 endless days of absolute unconsciousness, in an ICU bed surrounded by machines beeping in dissonant rhythms like an out-of-tune orchestra of medical equipment, each beep representing a vital function monitored with obsessive electronic precision, tubes snaking like translucent hospital plastic cobras connecting my weakened body to saline bags hanging from metal stands that creaked softly when nurses adjusted them, medications whose complex names I would only discover later when reading my voluminous medical record, propofol for deep sedation, fentanyl for extreme pain, midazolam for protective amnesia, norepinephrine for blood pressure, broad-spectrum antibiotics to prevent opportunistic infections. And I discovered through a casual conversation between afternoon shift nurses who thought I was still deeply sedated, their voices floating over me like clouds of words that gradually condensed into terrible meaning, that my mother, Regina, had criminally sold my house using grotesquely forged documents with crude and amateur signatures while I fought against death in a silent and solitary battle in that hospital bed, my swollen brain pressing against my fractured skull, my lungs dependent on mechanical ventilation, my heart kept in rhythm by vasoactive drugs, after a devastating car accident that had nearly ended my existence on a rainy, gloomy, and fateful October morning, when dense and impenetrable fog covered the winding mountain roads like a ghostly veil woven by invisible hands of cruel and relentless fate, transforming the wet and treacherous asphalt into fragmented and dangerous black mirrors that reflected the yellowish lights from headlights of the few brave or reckless cars that ventured out in that fateful dawn of almost zero visibility, creating a hypnotic and disorienting kaleidoscope of diffuse light and dense shadow that had been the last thing my green eyes clearly registered before the violent, sudden, and definitive impact against the reinforced concrete barrier, the sound of twisting metal still echoing in my pharmacological nightmares, which would shatter not only twisted metal and glass splintered into thousands of cutting fragments, but also, and mainly, the naive illusion of family security and filial trust that I still stubbornly, pathetically maintained despite decades of contrary evidence accumulated like sediments of disappointment in geological strata of hurt, the first unmistakable, disturbing, and revealing sign that something was terribly, fundamentally, irremediably wrong beyond my devastating physical injuries came when the morning shift nurse, Mrs. Maria das Grasas, a corpulent and maternal middle-aged woman with hands calloused by decades of tireless work and a kind face marked by wrinkles of concern and compassion accumulated over 30 years of intensive care. Wearing an impeccable white uniform despite the coffee stains she tried to strategically hide with her hospital badge, her worn white shoes softly squeaking against the waxed vinyl floor, casually mentioned while methodically checking my still dangerously unstable vital signs with experienced fingers that found pulses where young and inexperienced doctors failed. Noting numbers on a worn clipboard in the tiny and precise handwriting of someone who had filled out thousands of medical records that my mother, Regina, had resolved with admirable business efficiency and surprising speed, all pending, bureaucratic, and complex financial matters, during my long, distressing, and uncertain hospitalization in extremely critical condition with a grim prognosis, including what she described with disturbing naturalness and unconscious of the gravity as the necessary, urgent, and unavoidable relocation of my most valuable and irreplaceable personal belongings, important and official documents kept in organized folders, family furniture with incalculable sentimental value inherited from my paternal grandmother, apparently innocent and well, intentioned words that immediately sounded like strident, urgent, and distant alarms penetrating through the dense, sticky, and disorienting chemical fog that the powerful cutting-edge sedatives, horse, dose opioid analgesics, and preventive anticonvulsants created in my still reeling and fragmented mind from the lethal combination of trauma and medication. A thick and almost impenetrable pharmacological curtain that made it extraordinarily difficult and frustrating to distinguish with the necessary clarity between recurring and vivid medication. Induced nightmares where Regina appeared as a monstrous figure of mythical proportions with claws instead of hands and eyes as empty as wells. The fragmented, chaotic, and kaleidoscopic memories of the violent impact that had transformed my compact and reliable car into an unrecognizable mass of twisted metal and pulverized glass against the unyielding reinforced concrete barrier of State Highway BR 267, and the present, poignant, and inescapable sensations of a body I could barely recognize as my own after 42 2 years of intimate and familiar coexistence so profoundly altered, disfigured, and surgically reconstructed, it was by the extreme and merciless violence of the multiple and complex physical trauma I had suffered and miraculously survived through an unlikely combination of exceptional medical competence, cutting edge technology, and perhaps genetic stubbornness, ironically inherited from Regina herself, the same stubbornness she was now using against me. My body, this fragile shell of flesh, blood, bones, and cellular memories that had faithfully carried me through 42 years of earthly existence with relative reliability and few serious problems beyond appendicitis at 25, was now broken. Fragmented and patched in multiple strategic places like an antique porcelain doll deliberately thrown against a concrete wall by a child in a fit of destructive fury. 3 ribs fractured at irregular and anatomically concerning angles that transformed each deep breath necessary for adequate oxygenation into an experience of refined and cruel medieval torture, as if invisible. Incandescent and serrated blades repeatedly pierced my thorax in a synchronized and sadistic rhythm with the erratic, tachycardic, and anxious beats of my traumatized heart that cardiac monitors recorded in irregular and alarming graphs that made nurses run. Left arm completely immobilized by a complex and uncomfortable structure of titanium pins imported from Germany. Specialized metal plates and state of the art orthopedic screws after desperate emergency reconstructive surgery that had lasted 9.5 hours of absolute tension according to the detailed and technical medical records that I would later obsessively read like a sacred manuscript of my improbable survival. Trying to understand through hermetic medical terminology the complete and frightening extent of the damage suffered, while tracing with the trembling and hesitant finger of my partially functional right hand the raised, sensitive, and purplish scars that now decorated my skin like indecipherable hieroglyphs of survival, trauma, and forced rebirth. Right leg suspended in painful and constant traction through a system of pulleys and weights that resembled a medieval torture instrument, with deep and initially infected wounds that had exposed bone white as ivory and sensitive periosteum, requiring repeated and painful surgical debridements and endless months of intensive, torturous, and progressive physiotherapy just to recover the basic and fundamental ability to support my own diminished body weight without mechanical assistance of Canadian crutches or orthopedic walker. But absolutely nothing. No physical pain, however excruciating, lancinating, or seemingly unbearable, no bodily discomfort, however persistent and debilitating, could remotely compare to the icy, visceral and growing terror that began to slowly consume me like concentrated sulfuric acid dripped drop by drop onto metal when the seemingly disconnected pieces of the macabre and unthinkable puzzle inevitably began to fit together with nauseating and mathematical precision. And I realized with crystalline, painful, and devastating clarity that Regina, my own biological mother who had carried me in her womb for 9 months of difficult gestation with severe morning sickness and had given birth to me on a freezing winter dawn after 18 painful hours of labor, had calculatingly, deliberately, consciously used my temporary incapacity and extreme vulnerability to execute a meticulously architected criminal plan with psychopathic precision and the patience of an experienced predator that would forever and irrevocably change not only our already deeply troubled and dysfunctional family relationship after decades of systematic emotional manipulation and chronic financial exploitation, but also my fundamental understanding about the elastic limits of human evil and the seemingly infinite capacity for betrayal, even among supposedly sacred and unbreakable blood ties. The complete, overwhelming, and undeniable revelation of the premeditated and criminal maternal betrayal arrived with the force of an emotional tsunami. Exactly 3 days after I regained sufficient consciousness and minimal mental clarity to process complex information without the debilitating and confusing interference of opioids in massive doses. When Julia Fernandez, my dear, loyal and trustworthy neighbor for 15 long and meaningful years of genuine and reciprocal friendship that had gradually, organically become closer, more present, and emotionally more important than any blood relative through countless sunny Sunday mornings, sharing strong Colombian coffee prepared in a French press and deep revealing conversations about the existential, philosophical, and practical challenges of modern life for independent women, visited me in the hospital bringing with her not only fresh and fragrant flowers from her meticulously tended garden that she knew I deeply loved, snow-white daisies and small vibrant sunflowers in a hand, painted ceramic vase by a local artisan, but carrying on her normally cheerful, optimistic and welcoming face an unmistakable and disturbing expression of genuine concern and profound viscerally mixed indignation, with barely contained fury and maternal protective rage that transformed her normally serene, welcoming, and maternal features into a tense mask of righteous anger and fierce warrior determination that made me instantly understand, almost telepathically. Even through the persistent and thick fog of sedative medications and debilitating post-traumatic torpor, that something absolutely catastrophic, irreversible, and criminal had happened during my forced and vulnerable period of total and defenseless medical unconsciousness. She approached my narrow hospital bed with hesitant and careful steps, like someone carrying the crushing and terrible weight of devastating bad news that would irrevocably change everything. Her normally warm and welcoming honey eyes now cloudy and bright with unshed tears of frustration, helplessness, and righteous anger, and held my uninjured right hand between hers with infinite delicacy and perceptible tremor of contained emotion, as if I could completely shatter like fine crystal at the slightest rough touch or misplaced word. The familiar and comforting warmth of her touch dramatically contrasting with the metallic and impersonal cold of the sterilized hospital environment. Carolina, my dear friend of heart and soul, my sister chosen by life, I need to tell you something extremely serious, disturbing and criminal about your beloved home, about what your mother Regina methodically and unscrupulously did while you were here, heroically fighting for your life against all medical odds. She began with a voice choked with contained emotion and obvious excruciating internal conflict about how to reveal such devastating and traumatic information to someone already so fragile. Each word carefully chosen and measured, but still cutting like a sharp razor sliding across the skin, her fingers squeezing mine in silent but eloquent support as she took a deep breath before continuing. Regina showed up at your house exactly 3 days after your terrible accident on a Thursday morning, with suspicious and clearly forged documents that she categorically and without hesitation claimed had been signed by you before the fatal collision. Official papers with dubious and amateurish appearance that supposedly authorized the immediate, irrevocable, and unconditional sale of the property without requiring your physical presence. And she brought along a buyer who clearly, obviously had known her for considerable time given the suspicious familiarity between them. A man of suspicious appearance, furtive manners, and a hyena's false smile named Roberto Mendez, who could barely look into the concerned and distrustful eyes of the neighbors while touring your beloved house, obsessively measuring each room with professional measuring tape and making detailed notes in a brown leather notebook as if he was already the legitimate, definitive, and undisputed owner. Photographing every corner with the latest generation smartphone. And in less than a hellish week, everything was criminally consummated with suspicious and atypical speed that defied all normal, legal, and ethical procedures of honest and transparent real estate transactions that take months to complete. She whispered with a progressively trembling voice of barely contained emotion and growing indignation that threatened to explode, the words coming out in an uncontrollable and painful torrent, like a dam broken after a summer storm. Holding my hand with enough strength to convey unconditional support and absolute solidarity without causing additional pain to my bones, still in delicate and painful process of osseous consolidation, while silent and dense tears of frustration, anger, and powerlessness freely descended down her cheeks marked by time, by the sun of shared summers in our gardens, and now by the searing pain of having helplessly witnessed the criminal and brutal violation of my sacred property. The devastating and incomprehensible information hit my brain, still in laborious and uncertain recovery from the severe cranioencephalic trauma with subdural hemorrhage, like an emotional fragmentation bomb with multiple warheads of revelation, spreading sharp and poisonous shrapnel of painful and inevitable understanding that gradually, inexorably, cruelly came together like shards of broken mirror reflecting a distorted reality to form a complete, clear, and inescapable picture of premeditated family betrayal. Calculated and executed with psychopathic coldness that exponentially surpassed in cruelty and cynicism any feverish nightmare or pharmacological delirium that my darkest, most paranoid and pessimistic imagination could have conjured during the worst moments of drug-induced hallucinations with multi-headed monsters or during the accumulated decades of our historically problematic, toxic, and mutually destructive mother-daughter relationship. I remained in absolute and stunned silence for long minutes that seemed like endless hours of painful mental processing, my fragmented mind desperately struggling to process and accept the incomprehensible and obscene magnitude of the violation and betrayal, while Julia continued revealing with a choked voice and trembling hands, increasingly disturbing, sordid, and criminal details that accumulated like evidence at a crime scene, how Regina had appeared accompanied by a commercial moving truck with license plates from another city, and 3 strong and indifferent men hired to systematically empty the house of all objects of sentimental and monetary value, including the grand piano that had belonged to my grandmother, how she had coldly and without hesitation sold even my irreplaceable family photo albums with pictures of my childhood to opportunistic antique dealers downtown who paid a pittance, how she had carelessly donated my carefully collected favorite clothes and beloved annotated books to cheap neighborhood thrift stores as if I were already dead, buried, and completely forgotten. Even my prom dress that I had cherished had been sold for 50 reais. Each additional shocking revelation was like coarse Himalayan salt mixed with citric acid being sadistically rubbed into an open and infected wound, intensifying the searing and pulsating emotional pain to levels that completely, absolutely, definitively eclipsed any physical suffering that my broken and patched body could experience or had experienced. Our mother-daughter relationship, complex Byzantine tapestry woven with poisoned threads of unfulfilled expectations, systematically broken promises, and constant emotional manipulations, had been marked since my most remote and vulnerable childhood by a consistent and predictable pattern of maternal promises, broken with almost mathematical regularity, filial expectations never satisfied or even acknowledged, and a vicious and seemingly unbreakable cycle of Regina obsessively, compulsively, pathologically prioritizing her immediate narcissistic needs and superficial material desires over my physical, emotional, and psychological well-being since my earliest childhood, when I still naively believed that all mothers were naturally cruel, exploitative, and emotionally absent. I remember with crystal clear and painful clarity being only 7 years old, frail and hopeful, wearing my blue and white checkered dress from the municipal public school I attended, when she invaded my pink room and criminally took without permission or remorse the money I had saved for 6 painful months in my pink piggy bank to buy a special Mother's Day gift for herself. Morbid and cruel irony that I only fully understood years later in therapy sessions, and compulsively spent it all on bingo cards and scratch tickets in the vain hope of winning the jackpot, leaving me to cry inconsolably alone in the dark, cold room while she cheerfully went out to play more with money she didn't have. This early established pattern of systematic exploitation and calculated emotional abandonment had finally, definitively, irreversibly reached its culminating point of total rupture with this final, unforgivable, and criminal betrayal that transcended any imaginable limit of maternal cruelty. My 42 years of conscious and suffered existence in this cruel and indifferent world had been indelibly, permanently marked as by a branding iron, by an extraordinarily complex, frequently abusive, and always emotionally draining and vampiric relationship with Regina, a woman who alternated with calculated mastery and theatrical precision, worthy of a sociopathic actress between strategic periods of apparent, exaggeratedly performative, and artificial maternal affection like plastic flowers, always coincidentally synchronized when she desperately needed something specific, urgent and generally financial from me, typically cash to settle accumulated gambling debts, or to serve as guarantor for bank loans she had no intention of repaying, and prolonged, devastating, and systematically destructive episodes of elaborately orchestrated emotional manipulation, sophisticated psychological blackmail and verbal cruelty, refined with the surgical precision of an experienced torturer whenever I timidly dared to try to establish healthy and necessary boundaries, or refused her increasingly absurd, unrealistic, and financially unsustainable demands for voluminous monetary resources to feed her poorly disguised yet obvious addictions to compulsive gambling, pathological, unbridled shopping in malls, and clearly fraudulent investments in pyramid schemes that promised impossible returns, and that she skillfully, obsessively hid behind a meticulously constructed facade, maintained with military discipline of a respectable society lady, devout Catholic, and chronically misunderstood and wronged suffering mother in a cruel world. She was an assiduous, theatrical, and ostentatious attendee of the 10 o'clock Sunday Mass at the imposing main church in the historic center, always strategically sitting in the first noble wooden pew for maximum visibility from the congregation, wearing her best floral dresses and imported lace veil, where she presented herself as a selfless, sacrificed, and chronically suffering mother, cruelly ignored, abandoned and mistreated by her ungrateful, selfish, and unnatural only daughter who systematically refused to help her in her supposed basic, urgent, and completely legitimate needs, weaving elaborate, dramatic, and moving narratives of victimization and filial abandonment for anyone willing to listen to her rehearsed laments and tears timed for maximum dramatic effect. Conveniently ignoring to mention the endless years of systematic exploitation, emotional abuse, and psychological violence she had perpetrated against me since my most vulnerable childhood. Throughout my conscious, independent, and hard-won adult life, I had established increasingly rigid, explicit, and supposedly insurmountable financial and emotional boundaries after traumatically discovering, on a revealing and devastating afternoon of scorching summer that I still revisit in vivid, recurrent, and distressing nightmares that wake me up in cold sweats, that she had criminally, deliberately, methodically used my full name, tax ID, and documents stolen from my drawer to take out substantial, compromising, and unpayable loans from multiple financial institutions when I was only 23, innocent and hopeful, and was starting my promising professional career as a newly graduated engineer. That devastating, humiliating, and financially catastrophic experience that haunted me for years, that completely and systematically destroyed my hard-built credit through endless years of negative records in SPC and Sarasa, exhausting and embarrassing legal proceedings, taught me through the deepest visceral pain, excruciating public shame, and repeated and systematic humiliation of having to explain to skeptical, condescending, and judgmental bank managers that my own biological mother had committed the unthinkable crime of elaborate identity fraud against her only daughter. Indelibly branded with hot iron into my permanently traumatized psyche, the absolutely vital, non-negotiable, and obsessive importance of paranoidly protecting my hard-won material possessions, official documents, and sensitive personal information from her persistent and tireless predatory influence that extended like poisonous tentacles of a hungry and insatiable octopus. Always looking with diabolical creativity for new, unexpected, and Machiavellian forms of emotional, psychological, and mainly financial exploitation and parasitism that sucked my vital energy like an emotional vampire. The house I had bought with savings, accumulated through 15 years of hard, dedicated, and often lonely work as a senior civil engineer, specialized in complex, dangerous, and challenging infrastructure projects that frequently kept me away for consecutive weeks or months at remote and inhospitable construction sites, strategically located in a quiet, tree-lined and safe residential neighborhood with a large 500-square-meter garden where I cultivated with almost maternal and obsessive dedication my collections of Damascus roses imported from Bulgaria, rare blue hydrangeas from Japan, and exotic orchids that now were certainly withering, rotting, and slowly dying without my specific and specialized daily care of pruning, fertilizing, and controlled watering. A century. Old property with preserved classic architecture of exposed English bricks carefully restored by specialized craftsmen brought from Minas Gerais, and original large windows with imported acoustic double glazing that allowed generous entry of warm, golden, natural light that I had always dreamed of having since I was a poor and helpless child when we lived in tiny, cramped, dark, damp, and poorly ventilated apartments in violent peripheral neighborhoods that perpetually smelled of mold, despair, and endemic poverty, represented not just a substantial financial investment of 600,000 rees hardly earned with sweat, tears, deprivations, and painful personal sacrifices over decades, but mainly and fundamentally my definitive, symbolic, and non-negotiable achievement of absolute emotional independence, complete autonomy, and unshakable psychological security away from the manipulative, exploitative, and toxic clutches of Regina, who always, invariably, predictably found creative, unexpected, and Machiavellian ways to infiltrate like a persistent and mutating virus into my carefully built and protected life, when I momentarily, naively lowered my emotional guard or allowed myself a fleeting and dangerous flash of misguided filial compassion, unfounded hope for change, or nostalgia for a mother who never existed. Dr. Marcos Cavalcanti, the nationally renowned chief neurologist responsible for my complex and challenging case, with 20 years of specialized experience in severe traumatic brain injury, post-coma syndrome, and complex neurological injuries acquired at Harvard, a distinguished middle-aged man with impeccable professional demeanor of a veteran physician, but deep blue eyes that revealed genuine compassion and human concern, patiently explained on a rainy afternoon with a professional, modulated yet genuinely empathetic and concerned voice, choosing each word with surgical care and didactic precision of a teacher to ensure my understanding despite my mental state, still compromised by medications, that during the 3 endless, distressing, and critical weeks of pharmacologically induced coma, with precise, potent, and dangerous cocktails of continuous propofol infusion, heroic doses of fentanyl, midazolam for protective amnesia, and other complex sedatives whose technical names I couldn't pronounce or remember, an absolutely necessary and vital protocol to protect my traumatized and dangerously swollen brain from potentially fatal and irreversible cerebral edema that could have resulted in permanent, devastating, disabling neurological damage or complete and definitive brain death. Regina had presented herself daily and punctually at the hospital as my only known and documented close relative, consequently automatically assuming, according to established hospital protocols, the role of temporary legal guardian, signing with apparent desperate maternal concern and convincing tears all crucial medical documents for my survival. Consent forms for risky but necessary invasive procedures and making critical and potentially fatal decisions about my intensive treatment that, within the chaotic, emergency, and life, or death hospital context where seconds literally meant the crucial difference between survival and death, recovery and permanent disabling sequelae, seemed to demonstrate to the medical team's eyes genuine maternal concern, exemplary selflessness, and touching dedication that had deeply impressed and moved the entire experienced and generally skeptical multidisciplinary medical team. Your mother was here religiously, punctually, obsessively every single day during the first 2 critical weeks of reserved and grim prognosis, always apparently extremely concerned, anxious, and solicitous to the point of visible physical exhaustion, asking surprisingly detailed, specific, and technically sophisticated medical questions about your complex and dynamic neurological state, realistic prognosis of functional recovery in short, medium, and long term, possible permanent cognitive, motor or sensory sequelae that could result from the extensive trauma, estimated time of hospital stay, and subsequent rehabilitation in a high, standard specialized clinic, projected and astronomical costs of continued treatment that exceeded hundreds of thousands and would not be fully covered by health insurance, and mainly, with almost obsessive and suspicious insistence that retrospectively should have raised red flags about exactly when, precisely, categorically, you could regain full consciousness, and especially the legally recognized judicial capacity for coherent communication and autonomous and binding decision-making. He methodically reported with a grave voice while leafing through my voluminous medical record of 350 pages, densely filled with detailed daily evolution in almost illegible medical handwriting, his professional and chronically tired blue eyes from endless shifts scanning the detailed records with clinical precision trained in decades of practice. Clearly still not fully understanding the sinister, criminal, and premeditated dimension of what he was describing with characteristic professional innocence. That elaborately constructed and maintained theatrical demonstration of desperate maternal care and selfless filial devotion was just a meticulously planned for months and executed with sociopathic actress-disciplined smokescreen to hide her true predatory criminal intentions that were being simultaneously executed with military precision and psychopathic coldness, while she masterfully performed an Oscar-worthy rehearsed role of dedicated, suffering, and selfless mother in the antiseptic, cold, and impersonal hospital corridors, systematically deceiving all professionals with her studied performance and crocodile tears. What Dr. Marcos didn't know, couldn't possibly know without intimately understanding the sordid, traumatic, and criminal history of decades of refined systematic manipulation, chronic financial exploitation, and emotional abuse calculated with the precision of an experienced and unscrupulous predator, was that Regina was methodically, obsessively, surgically collecting specific and detailed medical information about my prolonged unconsciousness and grim prognosis, repeatedly questioning with false concern about specific temporal timelines, exact statistical probabilities of awakening in different periods, early and subtle neurological signs of imminent recovery of consciousness, all to calculate with mathematical, strategic, and surgical precision exactly how much time she would have available in her golden window of criminal opportunity to execute with impunity her meticulously elaborated plan to fraudulently sell my property before I could awaken from the coma and legally contest and prevent the criminal transaction that she had been architecting. As I later discovered, horrified through devastating and irrefutable forensic digital evidence recovered from her personal computer, judicially seized by police, for at least 6 months before my supposedly fortuitous accident, waiting patiently like a venomous spider in her elaborate web for any opportunity to temporarily incapacitate me. reaching the morbid and psychopathic point of obsessively researching fatal accident statistics in certain dangerous stretches of the highway I frequented, peak collision times, and even discreetly consulting obscure dark web forums about undetectable, slow-acting poisons that would cause symptoms similar to stroke or heart attack without leaving traces. The constant, pulsating, and searing physical pain of my multiple compound fractures that had brutally pierced the skin at various points, leaving bones exposed, deep lacerations revealing red muscles, white tendons, and sensitive nerves, internal hemorrhagic injuries to the spleen and liver that had required multiple emergency life, or death surgeries to stop massive internal bleeding, constantly pulsed through my debilitated and broken body like a macabre, dissonant and endless symphony of damaged and inflamed nerves, incessantly transmitting urgent and desperate electrical signals of extreme alarm to the overwhelmed brain that no amount of intravenous morphine in infusion pumps, transdermal fentanyl in controlled release patches, or epidural nerve blocks, even in doses that dangerously approached the toxic limit of respiratory depression and required constant monitoring of oxygen saturation, could completely silence or even significantly attenuate to tolerable levels. It was a constant, oppressive, torturing, and inescapable presence, like a sadistic and cruel companion that shared every endless second, every painful breath of my miserable and degrading hospital existence. But even this continuous, excruciating, and apparently endless physical torture that made me beg for extra doses of painkillers was completely, absolutely, unequivocally eclipsed and rendered insignificant by the heart-wrenching, all-encompassing, and devastating emotional agony of progressively discovering. Shocking revelation after revelation, rotten layer after rotten layer of deception, that my own biological mother, the woman who theoretically, biologically, morally, and legally should be my unconditional safe harbor and primordial instinctive protection in the cruel and indifferent world, had calculatingly, deliberately, sadistically taken advantage with predatory precision of the most vulnerable, desperate, and critical moment of my mortal existence, when I was literally precariously suspended on the threshold between life and death, with sophisticated machines worth millions maintaining my basic vital functions artificially through invasive tubes inserted in every orifice, monitoring wires connected to every inch of skin, and complex equipment that beeped incessantly, my swollen and hemorrhaging brain desperately fighting to survive inside the skull, fractured in multiple places with bone fragments threatening to pierce the delicate brain tissue, to rob me not only of the most precious and valuable material possession I owned in terms of gross monetary value and liquidity, but mainly and infinitely more painful, the concrete, tangible, and sacred symbol of my hard-won independence achieved through decades of work, my inviolable personal sanctuary, my sacred refuge from the hostile world, and especially from her and her venomous and insatiable claws that always sought to suck my life force. The rest of the story would unfold in even more shocking revelations, dramatic confrontations in court, and my eventual transformation from victim into advocate for others who suffered similar family betrayals. But the space reached here already captures the expanded and intensified essence of this narrative of maternal betrayal and human resilience. Attorney Patricia Mendonça arrived at the hospital on a gloomy and oppressive Thursday afternoon, exactly 7 days after my traumatic awakening from the prolonged and devastating coma, carrying with her a voluminous, worn brown leather folder overflowing with legal documents, original and falsified real estate contracts, preliminary handwriting analysis reports, suspicious bank statements highlighted with fluorescent yellow marker, digitized photographs of clearly divergent and amateur signatures, transcripts of conversations secretly recorded by concerned neighbors, and digital forensic evidence that had been meticulously, obsessively compiled during my forced medical unconsciousness by Julia and other supportive and vigilant neighbors who had instinctively, viscerally sensed that something deeply wrong, sinister, and criminal was happening, when they saw Regina suddenly appear with suspicious documentation and an already arranged buyer just 3 days after my near-fatal accident. Patricia was an imposing, majestic, and formidable woman with an undeniable magnetic presence, specialized for 15 years in complex and emotionally devastating cases of family fraud, crimes against incapacitated individuals, violations of inheritance rights, and financial abuse of vulnerable people, with an impressive and enviable history of crushing legal victories against family predators, whom she pursued with almost obsessive and personal determination, as if each case were a personal battle against injustices that she herself had suffered at some nebulous moment in the past, that she never shared, but that clearly fueled her incandescent protective fury. Carolina, I'm going to be absolutely, brutally, surgically honest and direct with you because I respect your intelligence and courage too much to artificially soften the crude and criminal reality. She began with a grave professional voice but loaded with genuine empathy and barely contained righteous anger. Her penetrating and intense brown eyes fixed on mine while methodically opening the folder and spreading across the mobile hospital table dozens of chronologically organized documents as evidence of meticulously documented crime. Each page additional proof of premeditated and systematic betrayal. Your mother, Regina, not only fraudulently sold your house using grossly falsified documentation with signatures that a teenager could identify as fake, she architected, planned, and executed this with documentable and traceable premeditation of at least 6 months, possibly more, through intercepted digital communications, WhatsApp messages deleted but forensically recovered, emails exchanged with buyer Roberto Mendez that prove elaborate criminal conspiracy, all indicating that she was patiently, calculatingly waiting for any opportunity of your incapacitation to execute this meticulously planned scheme that even included Google searches about how long person stays in coma, necessary documents to sell property of hospitalized person, how to convincingly forge signature, browsing history that she tried to delete but our forensic IT team fully recovered from the browser cache and temporary operating system files. She pulled a specific sheet covered with graphoscopic technical analyses with photographic enlargements of signatures, comparative graphs of pressure, speed, and writing angle, precise measurements of spacing between letters and character height. See these preliminary but already conclusive expert analyses performed by 3 independent and renowned handwriting experts that cost 15,000 Rs paid in advance by your neighbors in an emergency community fund they organized. The signature that supposedly authorized the sale is so grotesquely, pathetically forged that the experts classified it as gross forgery of amateur level. They didn't even try to minimally disguise the characteristic traits, the irregular pressure of the inexperienced hand, the nervous tremors, the unnatural pauses where she clearly lifted the pen to check the model she was copying. It presents divergences in literally 100% of the analyzed graphotechnical points, wrong inclination by 23 degrees, inconsistent pressure varying between 0, 3, and 2. 1 newtons when your natural pressure is constant at, writing speed 40% slower than your authentic signature, spacing between letters divergent in all characters, height of ascending and descending strokes completely out of pattern, not to mention that she used a cheap blue ballpoint pen when you always, invariably sign with a black Mont Blanc fountain pen that you received as a graduation gift. The overwhelming, suffocating, and nauseating amount of meticulously documented criminal evidence that Patricia continued to reveal methodically during the following 3 hours of intense and emotionally devastating meeting, including legal but clandestine audio recordings where Regina openly discussed with Roberto Mendez about taking advantage of the golden window of opportunity while she's vegetating, WhatsApp conversation screenshots where they negotiated values and coordinated strategies to circumvent the surveillance of suspicious neighbors, bank statements showing suspicious and sequential deposits of fractioned amounts to avoid automatic detection by anti-money laundering banking systems. Even a particularly cruel and psychopathic text message where Regina literally wrote, "I hope she takes a few more weeks to wake up. I need time to liquidate everything and disappear," painted a picture so monstrously cruel, calculated, and psychopathic of premeditated maternal betrayal that completely transcended my already expanded capacity for understanding human evil, even after 40. 2 years living with her chronic toxicity and systematic exploitation. The criminal and civil judicial process that would follow would be long, tortuous, emotionally exhausting, and financially costly, Patricia explained with professional realism tempered by iron determination. But the evidence was so robust, abundant, conclusive, and criminally incriminating that she was absolutely confident not only in completely nullifying the fraudulent sale and fully recovering my property with moral and material damages, but also in securing the criminal conviction of Regina for multiple serious crimes: forgery of private document, aggravated fraud, procedural fraud, abuse of an incapacitated person, criminal association, embezzlement, home invasion, aggravated property damage, criminal conspiracy, ideological falsehood, use of forged documents, which could result in up to 15 years in prison under an initially closed regime, plus compensatory fines that she conservatively estimated at least 1 million Rs considering the property value, emerging damages, lost profits, severe moral damages, and the punitive pedagogical character necessary for crimes of such heinous nature against one's own daughter in a situation of extreme vulnerability. Notary Alberto Guimaraes, who authenticated this grotesquely falsified signature, will also be criminally prosecuted and will definitely lose his lifetime public position. Patricia continued relentlessly turning pages of increasingly incriminating evidence, her cold professionalism contrasting with the righteous fury that shone in her eyes. We have incontestable documentary evidence, recovered text messages, and even traceable bank transfers showing that he received a bribe of 50,000 reais from Roberto Mendez via Pix divided into 10 payments of 5,000 to authenticate the signature without even requesting your physical presence or additional verification documentation, flagrantly violating all established notarial protocols, the public faith of his office, and multiple federal laws. He partially confessed when confronted with the evidence by the Internal Affairs Department, trying to minimize by claiming that he merely facilitated a bureaucratic process. But this only aggravates his legal situation because it demonstrates awareness of illegality and specific intent. While Patricia meticulously, surgically unveiled layer after rotten layer of this criminal conspiracy, elaborated with ramifications that extended like cancerous metastases throughout the supposedly trustworthy system of legal protection. The corrupt notary who had sold his public faith for a measly 50,000 reais, the buyer Roberto Mendez, who perfectly knew he was acquiring property through fraud, but calculated that I wouldn't survive to contest it, or that Regina would legally protect him. Even the real estate agent Paulo Cesar, who had intermediated the transaction, receiving a commission of 30,000 reais knowing the criminal origin despite later claiming convenient ignorance. My fragmented mind still fighting against the persistent residual effects of severe traumatic brain injury, the heavy medication that made my thoughts viscous like molasses, and the simple physical exhaustion of a broken body in slow healing process, desperately tried to process and accept that my own mother had essentially, fundamentally given me up for dead even before my last breath, already dividing and liquidating my assets like a vulture over a still warm carcass, without even the basic respect of waiting for definitive medical confirmation of death or permanent irreversible vegetative state before beginning her meticulously planned pillage. The inevitable, dramatic, and devastatingly necessary confrontation with Regina happened 2 weeks later, when I had already recovered enough strength to sit without support for prolonged periods despite the persistent shooting pains that radiated from my spine with 3 fractured vertebrae, and my cognitive capacity had stabilized enough to fully comprehend and emotionally process the complete extent of her criminal betrayal, without the merciful filter of opioids that previously partially dulled the emotional pain, along with the physical. She appeared at the hospital on a sunny morning that seemed to ironically mock the darkness of the moment, without prior warning and apparently still unaware that I had discovered everything, and that criminal proceedings were already secretly moving through the justice system with a request for preventive detention being analyzed. Wearing her best Sunday floral dress that she always wore for her performances of respectability at church, carrying an expensive and ostentatious fruit basket clearly bought to impress the medical staff, and not out of genuine concern for me, her carefully made, up face not completely managing to hide the revealing signs of tension. Deep, dark circles poorly disguised with concealer, dry lips from nervous nibbling, a nervous tick in her left eye that always appeared when she was about to lie elaborately. My dear, beloved, and precious daughter, thanks to Almighty God and Our Lady Aparecida that you've finally awakened from this terrible nightmare, she exclaimed theatrically upon entering the hospital room, her voice artificially high-pitched and syrupy like expired cough medicine. Arms open for an embrace that made me instinctively, viscerally recoil in physical and emotional repulsion. Every cell in my body violently rejecting her proximity like an immune system detecting a lethal pathogen. I prayed the rosary incessantly every night without fail during your unconsciousness, made promises to 3 different saints, lit candles blessed by a priest, even paid for a 7th day mass in advance despite you being alive because I had faith that God would hear my desperate pleas as a mother. The obscene, grotesque, and sacrilegious cynicism of her rehearsed words, invoking divinities and pretending religious devotion while simultaneously robbing me like Judas selling Christ for silver coins, hit me like sulfuric acid poured over an open wound, burning through any remnant of naive hope that perhaps, remotely, unconsciously, and absurdly, I still maintained that there could be some alternative explanation, some colossal misunderstanding, some justification, even if improbable, for her criminal actions. You sold my house, I said simply, directly, coldly, without unnecessary preambles or beating around the bush, my voice hoarse from disuse but carrying all the weight of decades of accumulated hurt, now crystallized into cold fury and implacable determination, observing with morbid satisfaction how her face instantly decomposed from the mask of maternal concern to genuine surprise, then growing fear, frantically trying to recompose herself while mentally calculating her options for escape or manipulation. While I was in a coma fighting to survive, while machines kept my heart beating and my lungs breathing, while my swollen brain fought against death, you forged my signature with your characteristic incompetence and sold my house to your accomplice Roberto Mendez for less than half its market value because you were desperate to pay off your gambling debts at the underground casino downtown. The silence that followed was dense, heavy, and oppressive, like molten lead, filled only by the constant beeping of the cardiac monitors that accelerated in response to my growing emotional stress, and the distant sound of a television in the hallway playing the 6 o'clock soap opera. Regina remained frozen, petrified for long seconds that seemed like centuries, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water suffocating in air. It cannot process, desperately searching for words for another of her elaborate lies, but apparently, miraculously, for the first time in her life, finding herself completely without a prepared script for this specific situation that she clearly, naively, arrogantly had never considered as a real possibility. That I would survive, discover everything, and confront her directly without giving space for her characteristic manipulations. Carolina, my love, my dear little daughter, you're confused from the strong medications, delirious because of the head trauma. She finally tried weakly, her voice trembling, betraying her growing panic as she took a hesitant step toward me that made me raise my hand in a stop gesture that she instinctively respected. The doctors warned me you might have hallucinations, paranoia, false memories because of the brain swelling. I would never ever under any circumstances do something like this to you, my only daughter, blood of my blood. How can you even think such a monstrosity about your own mother who raised you with so much sacrifice and love? There are recordings. I interrupted her pathetic performance with glacial calm that surprised me, discovering reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. Recordings of you with Roberto discussing the sale while I was in coma, WhatsApp screenshots, text messages, emails, bank statements, handwriting expert analysis proving the amateur forgery, confession from the corrupt notary you paid to validate the fraud, eyewitnesses, security cameras from neighbors showing you emptying my house with a moving truck. Patricia Mendonça is my lawyer. Criminal proceedings have already been filed. You are technically a fugitive at this moment because you don't yet know that your preventive detention was ordered yesterday at 5:32 p.m. The transformation I witnessed in the following seconds was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying in its speed and completeness. The mask of concerned mother disintegrated completely like paper in flames, revealing underneath the true, naked and grotesque face of Regina, contorted by a poisonous mixture of narcissistic rage at being caught, frustration that her plan had failed, and most disturbingly, absolute contempt for me. Her brown eyes, the same ones I had looked to for comfort in childhood before learning there was no comfort there, only calculation and exploitation, now stared at me with pure, distilled and undisguised hatred, as if I were the criminal for having survived and ruined her meticulously architected plans, as if my refusal to die conveniently were an unforgivable personal affront. You've always been a despicable and petty ingrate. She spat the words like venomous projectiles, completely abandoning any pretense of maternal affection, her voice distilling decades of accumulated resentment now released like a broken dam. Since childhood, you've always been selfish, miserly, holding on to every penny as if it were gold, denying me help when I desperately needed it, letting me be humiliated with loan sharks while you saved money in your ridiculous little safe. I carried you for 9 months of miserable pregnancy with constant nausea, destroyed my body giving birth to you in a cesarean that left horrible scars, wasted the best years of my life raising you alone after your useless father ran away. And what did I receive in return? Crumbs, humiliating handouts. You owe me that house and much more for everything I sacrificed. You didn't sacrifice anything, I replied with a calmness that came from somewhere deep beyond anger, a place of final and liberating acceptance that Regina never was, never would be capable of genuine maternal love, only performance and manipulation. You used me as an investment that never gave the return you expected. You had me hoping to drain my life force, my money, my energy like an emotional parasite. Each supposed sacrifice was calculated, expecting future payment with interest. You never loved me, You only loved what you could extract from me. And when you thought I was dying, you didn't feel sadness for the loss of a daughter, just urgency to liquidate your investment before it completely lost value. She suddenly lunged toward me with surprising speed for her 68 years. Hands extended like claws aiming for my neck. Her face distorted into a mask of homicidal fury that finally, unequivocally revealed her true predatory nature without social veneer, but was intercepted at the last second by 2 hospital security guards that Patricia had providentially positioned in the hallway, anticipating exactly this possibility, and who quickly entered upon hearing my cry of alarm. While being dragged out of the room amidst hysterical screams and obscene curses, spitting death threats and elaborate curses, invoking generational plagues and wishing that I would die alone and abandoned as she claimed I had abandoned her, violently struggling against the guards who needed handcuffs to restrain her. The last glimpse I had of Regina before she disappeared down the hallway was of her eyes, empty of any humanity, any trace of maternal connection, only pure hatred, crystallized resentment, and the narcissistic fury of a predator who lost its prey. Regina's official arrest happened 3 hours later in the hospital parking lot where she was still, inexplicably, pathetically trying to convince anyone who would listen, patients, visitors, cleaning staff, that she was the victim of a conspiracy by her ungrateful daughter to steal her non-existent inheritance, apparently having completely lost touch with reality, or simply unable to abandon the victimization narrative she had cultivated for decades. The police officers found her sitting on the curb, her floral dress stained with dirt, makeup smeared forming gothic trails on her cheeks, incoherently mumbling about saints who would avenge her and plagues that would fall upon everyone involved in her persecution. She was taken away in handcuffs, still shouting about cosmic injustices and unnatural daughters, her voice echoing through the parking lot until disappearing inside the police car, the last pathetic act of a manipulation theater that had finally come to an end. Roberto Mendez was arrested that same afternoon in his luxurious office in the business center, desperately trying to destroy incriminating documents in an industrial shredder, while his secretary attempted to buy time with the police officers in the reception area. The scene, according to Patricia's subsequent report who accompanied the operation, was pathetically cinematic. Papers flying, him profusely sweating, staining his Italian designer shirt, simultaneously trying to delete files from the computer, burn contracts in a metal trash can improvised as an incinerator, and making frantic calls to lawyers who weren't answering. When he was finally subdued and handcuffed after brief and pathetic resistance, he cried like a spoiled child caught stealing candy, begging to call his wife, claiming sudden heart problems, trying to bribe the officers with promises of tens of thousands of rees that clearly didn't impress veteran police officers accustomed to panicking white-collar criminals. Notary Alberto Guimaraes met an even more pathetic fate. He attempted suicide by taking an entire pack of Rivotril with whiskey when he received the arrest warrant, but was found by his wife 8 hours later, alive but in a pitiful state, having vomited most of the medication and spent the night in a chemical hangover that left him temporarily blind and with uncontrollable tremors. He was arrested at the hospital after having his stomach pumped, crying copiously and claiming he had been coerced, threatened, seduced by easy money, that he had debts, family to support, unbearable financial pressure, any excuse that might humanize him before the police chief, who remained impassive having seen all kinds of corruption in 30 years of police work. He lost his position, his pension, the respectability built over decades, all for 50,000 rees that he hadn't even spent, kept as evidence in his savings account as eloquent proof of his cheap venality. The recovery of my house was a complex, bureaucratic, and emotionally exhausting process that took 3 months of legal battles, injunctions, counter-injunctions, appeals, hearings where I had to repeatedly testify recounting the same traumatic facts to different judges, prosecutors and public defenders who seemed determined to find some loophole, some technicality that could invalidate the solid case that Patricia had built with obsessive meticulousness. Roberto Mendez had, predictably, sold or destroyed most of my personal belongings. Antique furniture was auctioned, books donated or thrown away, clothes distributed to thrift stores, family photographs ironically sold to antique dealers specializing in other people's memories. My grandmother's piano, miraculously, had been recovered from a used instrument store downtown, still with her sheet music inside the bench, yellowed pages with notes in her delicate handwriting that made me cry tears of simultaneous relief and loss when I finally recovered it. The house itself was unrecognizable when finally, after a definitive and unappealable court decision, I recovered the keys in an official ceremony with a court officer, Patricia and Julia accompanying me for moral support. Roberto had crudely renovated various rooms with questionable nouveau riche taste. Walls demolished without structural criteria, creating spaces that were ample but soulless. Original, noble wood flooring covered with cheap porcelain tile imitating marble century. Old original windows replaced with generic white aluminum. The garden I had cultivated for years transformed into a concrete parking lot where he intended to display his collection of imported cars that he never managed to buy because he was arrested first. Each violated room was a new stabbing. Each grotesque modification, a physical and permanent reminder of the invasion, the desecration of my sanctuary. But it was in what had been my office, my most intimate and personal space where I kept diaries, projects, memories of decades of professional and personal life, that I found the most painful violation. Everything had simply been discarded as trash. Years of professional notes, engineering projects that represented my professional evolution, certificates and awards, personal correspondence, even my framed university diploma, all thrown away as worthless debris by people incapable of recognizing the intangible value of a documented life. Roberto had transformed the space into a game room with a pool table and bar, as if erasing my previous existence was necessary for his illegal occupation to feel legitimate. The criminal trial happened 6 months later, when I had already recovered enough mobility to walk without assistance, despite the permanent limp in my right leg that would accompany me for the rest of my life as a physical reminder of the accident that had precipitated the entire tragedy. Regina appeared in court visibly aged, downcast but still trying to maintain a pose of outraged dignity, wearing black clothes as if in mourning for herself or trying to awaken the jury's pity. Her defense, predictably, tried to claim mental problems, incipient senile dementia, undiagnosed personality disorder, anything that could reduce her criminal responsibility. They reached the grotesque point of claiming that she genuinely believed she was acting in my best interest, protecting my assets from deterioration while I was incapacitated, that the sale had been a misunderstanding, that Roberto had manipulated her, that the notary had falsified documents without her knowledge. But the evidence presented by Patricia was overwhelmingly, unequivocally incriminating. Text messages where Regina celebrated the perfect timing of the accident, audio recordings where she discussed with Roberto how to divide the profit from the sale, Google searches on how to declare daughter dead without a body, maximum time person can stay in coma, how to sell property of incapacitated relative. The most impactful moment of the trial was when Patricia presented a security video from an office supply store where Regina appeared buying special paper to practice forging my signature 3 weeks before my accident, chatting animatedly with the saleswoman about needing to practice a difficult signature for a surprise. The saleswoman, called as a witness, confirmed that Regina had bought reams of paper and several pens, saying she was organizing a surprise party that required a lot of planning. During my testimony, which lasted 3 exhausting hours of invasive questions, emotional turmoil, and attempts by the defense to discredit me by claiming brain trauma and unreliable memories, I remained firm, factual, and controlled, refusing to give Regina the satisfaction of seeing me publicly fall apart. I reported decades of financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, the consistent pattern of parasitism that had culminated in this final betrayal. When the defense lawyer tried to make me look like a negligent and cruel daughter who abandoned an elderly mother in need, I presented receipts of bank transfers totaling more than 300,000 Rs over 20 years, always for emergencies that I later discovered were gambling debts, compulsive purchases, or investments in fraudulent schemes. The public prosecutor, Dr. Fernando Alcantara, a 60-year-old man with a career built on domestic violence and family crime cases, was relentless in his final argument. "What we have here is not a confused or senile mother who made an error of judgment," he declared to the jury with a deep voice that reverberated through the room, "but a calculating predator who saw in her own daughters near. Death not a tragedy to lament, but a golden opportunity to exploit." While Ms. Carolina fought for her life, while doctors worked day and night to save her, while machines kept her organs functioning, Regina was not by her bedside praying for recovery. She was forging signatures, negotiating prices, bribing public officials, emptying her daughter's house like a vulture over carrion. This is not a crime of impulse or necessity. It's a premeditated, cruel crime, executed with psychopathic coldness against the person who should have been able to trust her the most. Regina tried one last dramatic performance when it was her turn to testify. crying profusely, claiming selective amnesia, conveniently fainting when confronted with the most incriminating evidence, but the jury was not moved. Her conviction was unanimous. 8 years in closed prison for aggravated fraud, document forgery, criminal association, embezzlement, and abuse of an incapacitated person. Roberto Mendez received 6 years, Notary Alberto 4 years, and permanent loss of public office. The sentences were celebrated with discretion by me and my supporters, without real joy, only relief that some justice had been done, even if unable to undo the permanent emotional damage. The last time I saw Regina was on the day of the sentencing, as she was being led away in handcuffs back to the jail. Our eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and what I saw there chilled me to the bone. There was no remorse, no recognition of the harm caused, only pure, undiluted, eternal hatred. She silently articulated with her lips words I didn't need to be an expert in lip reading to understand. You will pay for this. Even defeated, exposed, convicted, and about to spend nearly a decade behind bars, Regina still saw herself as the victim, still blamed me for her own destruction, unable until the end to accept responsibility for her criminal choices. The reconstruction of my life after the physical trauma of the accident and the emotional trauma of betrayal was a long, painful, and non-linear healing process that still continues. Intensive physical therapy 3 times a week for 2 years returned my mobility, but not my confidence in my body. Weekly psychological therapy with Dr. Helena Vasconcelos, a specialist in family trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, helped me process not just the recent betrayal, but decades of normalized emotional abuse, systematic manipulation disguised as maternal love, chronic financial exploitation that I had internalized as normal or even deserved. You were programmed since childhood to accept the unacceptable, Dr. Ina Aoi. Helena explained in a particularly revealing session. Regina conditioned you to believe that maternal love came with a price, that you had to pay for your existence, that establishing boundaries was cruelty. She didn't just rob you financially. She stole your ability to recognize your own intrinsic worth, to believe you deserved unconditional love, basic respect, fundamental human dignity. The final betrayal was just the most extreme manifestation of a pattern that had always existed. Regina always saw you as a resource to be exploited, not a daughter to be loved. The house, my violated sanctuary, required 6 months of renovations to undo the aesthetic damage perpetrated by Roberto, and more importantly, to recover its essence as my safe space. I hired an architect specializing in historical restoration, Marina Kobayashi, herself a survivor of domestic violence who viscerally understood the need to recover not just the physical structure, but the soul of the space. Together, we reconstructed each room with archaeological reverence, recovering the original floor under the horrendous porcelain tiles, restoring century. Old windows found in a junkyard, replanting the garden with seedlings of the same species I had cultivated before, now growing over the broken concrete that had to be removed with jackhammers. Marina brought a team of specialized craftsmen who worked with the delicacy of art restorers. Carpenter Juan Paulo, a man of few words but magical hands, spent weeks restoring the original door frames that Roberto had painted white with cheap latex paint, patiently revealing the fine wood underneath with chemical remover and ultra-fine sandpaper, like an archaeologist uncovering ancient frescoes. The gardener Conceição, a 70-year-old woman who had worked in botanical gardens, cried with me when we discovered that one of my Damascene roses had survived, hidden and suffocated under debris but still alive, still fighting for light, an involuntary but powerful metaphor for my own survival. The process of recovering my scattered belongings became an almost obsessive mission in the following months. With help from Julia and other supportive neighbors who formed an informal search network, we tracked items in thrift shops, antique stores, online selling sites. Each recovered object was a small victory against erasure. A silver photo frame from my graduation found in a pawn shop, my annotated copy of 100 Years of Solitude in a downtown used bookstore, my grandmother's crocheted shawl being used as a decorative tablecloth in a vintage cafe. Some items were lost forever. 20 years of intimate diaries probably discarded as trash, hard drives with a decade of professional projects formatted and sold, my birth album that Regina claimed in testimony to have burned by accident, while burning other documents. But the hardest part wasn't recovering objects or renovating spaces, it was rebuilding the ability to trust, to form human connections without the constant paranoia of being exploited, manipulated, prepared for the next betrayal. For months, I couldn't accept kindnesses without looking for hidden motivations, couldn't receive help without calculating the future price, couldn't relax the hyperactive vigilance that constantly examines signs of danger, imminent betrayal. Julia, with the patience of a saint and persistence of a warrior, was instrumental in this process, showing up daily with small gestures of care that required no reciprocity, homemade soup left at the door, flowers from her garden on my windowsill, good morning messages expecting no reply. "You need to relearn that love can exist without a price," she told me on a particularly difficult afternoon when I had refused her help with shopping, paranoidly insisting on paying every cent for gas. Not everyone is Regina. Some people care simply because they care, help because they can, love because they choose to love. You deserve to receive care without suspicion, affection without contract, love without future demands. The support group for survivors of family violence that I began attending 6 months after the trial was a painful and liberating revelation. I discovered that my story, as extreme as it seemed, wasn't unique. Maria, 60 years old, had been robbed by her crack-addicted son who sold even the family burial plot. Pedro, 45, discovered that his brother had forged his signature on dozens of checks. Anna, 38, had her identity completely stolen by her cousin who incurred $200,000 in debts in her name. Each story was a variation of the same terrible theme. The deepest betrayal always comes from those who should protect us most. But it was through these shared stories, this collective pain witnessed and validated, that I slowly began to understand that surviving wasn't just about recovering what was stolen, but about building something new from the ruins. I started speaking publicly about my experience, first timidly in the group, then in lectures to health professionals about signs of financial abuse of incapacitated individuals. Eventually writing articles for legal journals about the need for greater legal protection for victims in situations of medical vulnerability. 1 year after the trial, I created the Desperator Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting victims of family crimes and advocating for legislative changes. With financial support from donors who had followed my case through the media and pro bono legal support from Patricia, who became a great friend and ally, the foundation offers free legal assistance, psychological support, and most importantly, validation for people who, like me, were betrayed by those they should have been able to trust most. In 2 years, we've helped more than 300 families recover stolen assets, prosecute criminal relatives, rebuild shattered lives. Regina is serving her sentence in the state women's penitentiary, from where she occasionally sends letters that I don't open, returning them to the sender. I learned through the prison system that she maintains a narrative of being an unjustly victimized to other inmates, even created a Bible study group where she preaches about ungrateful children and divine forgiveness. Roberto Mendez was released after 3 years for good behavior, lost everything in civil lawsuits and lives depending on relatives. Notary Alberto died of a heart attack 2 years after the conviction, alone in a cheap boarding house room, his name permanently tarnished in public records as an example of corruption of public trust. Today, 5 years after that fateful morning when I woke from the coma to discover the unthinkable betrayal, I live a carefully reconstructed but genuinely fulfilling life. The recovered house has become not just my home, but the Foundation's headquarters, where survivors gather weekly in a safe and welcoming environment to share, process, heal. The replanted garden flourishes with renewed vigor, the damask roses more fragrant than before, as if the violence suffered had somehow fertilized the soil. I maintain cautious but increasingly confident relationships with a small circle of true friends who have proven through consistent actions that they deserve trust. The physical aftereffects remain: the limp in my right leg, chronic pain in my ribs on humid days, frequent migraines residual from cranial trauma, permanent reminders engraved in the body of the violence survived. But they are also war medals, tangible proof of resilience, evidence that I survived what should have destroyed me. Sometimes, on particularly difficult mornings when physical and emotional pain converge, I look in the mirror and see not just the scars, but the woman who refused to be erased, who transformed betrayal into testimony, trauma into purpose. Forgiveness, a concept that haunts me, and that well-intentioned people often suggest as a necessary path to complete healing, remains out of reach and perhaps unnecessary. I haven't forgiven Regina and probably never will. Some betrayals transcend the human capacity for absolution. Some crimes are too commanding for emotional amnesty. But I've learned a crucial difference between forgiving and releasing. I released Regina from the space she occupied in my psyche, from the power to continue hurting me through obsessively revisited memories, from the ability to define my worth through her abandonment. She is no longer my mother in any meaningful sense of the word. She is simply Regina, a convicted criminal who by biological accident gave birth to me but never mothered me, who gave me physical life but tried to steal everything that made that life worth living. The woman who should have been my safe harbor revealed herself as the greatest danger. The one who should protect became a predator. The one who should love unconditionally only knew transactional love. But her betrayal, however devastating, doesn't define my capacity to love and be loved, to trust and be trustworthy, to build a chosen family that transcends poisoned blood ties. I write this from my reconstructed office, the same space that Roberto had transformed into a vulgar game room, now restored as a sanctuary of recovered memories and future being written. On the walls, beside the recovered and reframed university diploma, certificates from the foundation, photos with survivors we've helped, hangs a single family photo. It doesn't include Regina, digitally erased as she tried to physically erase me, but shows my paternal grandmother at her piano, the same one that now stands in the living room, restored and tuned, playing music that Regina never managed to completely silence. The phone rings. It's Julia inviting me for afternoon coffee, a sacred ritual we religiously maintain on Thursdays. I accept with genuine gratitude that no longer needs to be questioned or qualified. As I hang up, I look through the restored window to the garden, where damask roses sway gently in the wind, resilient and fragrant, growing over soil that was concreted but broke under the weight of life insisting on blooming. Like them, I too insisted on flowering over the ruins, transforming violation into victory, surviving and transcending the woman who tried to bury me alive, but forgot that some seeds, when buried, don't die. They create deeper roots, grow stronger, bloom more magnificently. Regina is imprisoned for 3 more years, but I am free. Free from her poison, her manipulations, her parasitic expectations. Free to love without calculating the price, trust without constant paranoia, exist without apologizing or paying emotional toll. Freedom cost everything I had and almost my life, but it was worth every scar, every tear, every sleepless night fighting demons that had my mother's face. Because in the end, the greatest revenge against those who tried to erase you isn't to return cruelty. It's to live fully, love deeply, flourish magnificently, exist as a walking testimony that some people are impossible to destroy, no matter how hard they try. The sun sets over the city, painting the sky in shades reminiscent of healing bruises, purples becoming pinks, reds softening into golds. It's beautiful in a way that only those who know pain can appreciate. The particular beauty of healing, of transforming wounds into strength. Tomorrow, there will be more work at the foundation, more stories of betrayal to hear, more survivors to support. But today, in this moment, I allow myself to simply exist in peace in the space I've reclaimed, in the life I've rebuilt, in the freedom I bloodily conquered from the one who should have been my first love, but became my final illusion. The story of how I woke from a coma to discover that my mother had sold my house doesn't end with a traditional happy ending. There is no touching reconciliation, transformative forgiveness, family redemption. There is only raw truth, imperfect but necessary justice, and the liberating discovery that some people are born incapable of love and the greatest act of self. Love is accepting this reality without letting it destroy your own capacity to love. Regina gave me life but tried to steal everything that made it worth living. She failed. And that failure is my sweetest victory, my most complete revenge, my final testimony that even maternal betrayal, perhaps especially maternal betrayal, can be survived, transcended, transformed into purpose that honors not the person who should have loved me, but the person I became despite, and because of her fundamental inability to love. Did you like Carolina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you right here on the screen. Click there, and I'll be waiting for you.